From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Carl Riccadonna on the hiring surge last month in the U.S. before the coronavirus hit. Kevin Cirilli in Washington on the Trump administration's response to that virus. And in New York, Jeannie Zaino on the two-man race that has become the Democratic presidential nomination contest. Okay, so Carl, let's start with you. We got the jobs numbers out there. Were very encouraging in many respects. Good news, but as I say, before the virus.
Sure. So things looked great before the virus set in. When we look back to what was happening during the week where they were actually conducting the employment survey, stocks were just a hair's breadth from all-time highs. 10-year yields were about 160. So very different environment. And then the virus hits.
You know what? We want to hear exactly what you say, and your mic's down there. So let's try this again, Carl, because I want to hear every word you say. There you go. Try it again.
Okay, a voice. So basically, this was a snapshot of the economy before all of the crisis hit. And it looked very strong, although even there's a bit of a caveat because we had this very warm winter, which means that all of the seasonal factors for things like layoffs in the construction sector are behaving very strangely relative to what's ordinarily the case. So hiring looked good pre-crisis, but not quite as good as the headline numbers suggest.
So this is what I wonder. We had the job numbers coming out. We had the president speak and say, well, look, those are great numbers. We don't have much of a problem here. And you had Larry Kudlow, his chief economic advisor, saying, boy, you know, maybe a little slowdown, but we're looking good. Is this potentially an instance of good news being bad news in the sense that it makes the administration say, we don't need to worry about the economy very much?
That's a very big problem, and we can see investors are treating it accordingly. So when Larry Kudlow in his press conference is saying we need a targeted response here, narrowly targeted, controlled, temporary, targeted and temporary, I think was the expression he used. To me, this has echoes of summer of 2008 during the early stages of the financial crisis when we were again in a presidential campaign, and John McCain's chief advisor, Phil Gramm, was talking about a mental recession and a nation of whiners. And when it became very clear that the McCain administration did not have a grasp on how to deal with a very fast-moving and large crisis, markets lost confidence, and that was when we suddenly saw the Obama team surge in terms of support with hopes of having a better economic plan in place. And you know, I think there's going to have to be a moment of reckoning here where we realize we need a major multi-pronged approach on healthcare policy, monetary policy, so further accommodation from the Fed, and also a stronger fiscal
exactly
policy
right.
as well.
Okay, well said. Okay, thank you so much to Carl Riccadonna. He's our chief U.S. economist. And now let's turn to Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. We've gotten into this already a little bit, Kevin. The president and Larry Kudlow seem to be fairly confident about where we are. Do they know something we don't know?
They're still projecting optimism. And in fact, the president earlier today here at the White House signing $8.3 billion worth of an aid package that lawmakers advanced just a few days ago, bipartisan group, in order to combat the spreading coronavirus. Now, $3 billion of that package is going to go specifically towards vaccine research, and slightly more than $2 billion is going to be spread out in order to fight for preparedness throughout the country. Meanwhile, lawmakers also starting to look at the economic implications of this. Yesterday, Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, saying that they are having open conversations in the Capitol about what would happen should the coronavirus have to impact legislators and get onto Capitol Hill. There have been reported cases in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Meanwhile, in addition to that, I caught up with Senator Mark Warner yesterday, David, Democrat from Virginia, top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. He told me that he's looking at, quote unquote, regulatory forbearance issues as it relates to the regulators giving a nod of sorts to financial institutions who may have to provide some more leniency for consumers as delays are becoming more anticipated over the next couple of months, potentially because of the coronavirus. David?
So, Kevin, that all sounds encouraging. We've got the $8.3 billion and things. But for me, it's sort of first things first. How do we know how many people have the disease right now? Because we haven't done the testing. Where is the testing? Where is Mr. Azar from HHS? Do we know where we are on testing?
In terms of the money that came specifically a portion of that will actually go specifically toward the testing. Now, I can tell you that, to your point, there's been open conversations, and I've spoken with lawmakers yesterday about this particular issue, about the need for there to be free tests, about the need for there to be more public awareness as to how to, in fact, get tested. All of those questions are being openly discussed in real time. And the final point that you raised about data is crucial to all of this precisely. Yesterday, I spoke with two top officials in both parties who raised the concern that the data coming out of China is not to be trusted and has not been accurate. And so Senator Warner as well alluded to that as well. So a lot of questions are surrounding the how to get accurate data as it relates to the coronavirus.
Yeah, and certainly investors have a lot of questions as reflected in the markets even today. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, reporting from the White House. And now let's bring in college professor and Bloomberg contributor Jeannie Zaino here in New York, because the coronavirus is the big story, no question about it, but we also have something of an election going on.
Something of an election.
At the same time. So give us a sense. We lost Elizabeth Warren yesterday, and then there were sort of two, except Tulsi Gabbard, but there were basically two running on the Democratic side. What is the path forward here, particularly as we look forward to next Tuesday when we have, I think, 10 primaries?
Yeah, it's going to be a big day, and really many people are sort of lining this up as your home state of Michigan being a really important state for Bernie Sanders. And we heard today he has canceled an appearance he had in Jackson, Mississippi, and he is putting all of his efforts now into Michigan. He really does feel like this is a must-win state for him. He is ceding the South, it is pretty apparent now, and the African-American vote to Vice President Biden.
And it was thought that he was doing very well in Michigan. He did very well in 2016 in Michigan, as I recall, beat Hillary Clinton fairly handily in the state of Michigan. At the same time, we have to remember he's for canceling the private health insurance. We have a lot of UAW workers, for example, from my home state of Michigan, and they're not too keen on losing their insurance that they've negotiated so hard for over the years.
Absolutely. This is one of the big question marks. He did so well with these Midwestern states, including Michigan in 2016, and he has not changed his position on this issue of privatization of health insurance. And so how the union workers look at that, he does have some real support in Michigan. He's well organized. He's got a lot of money to spend up there. Joe Biden still has to catch up to him in that regard. But we also know that a lot of voters out there, what we're seeing from the exit polls from Super Tuesday, is a lot of voters out there and around the country really see this as a must-win for getting Donald Trump out. And so we may see voters, particularly late deciders, pushing themselves again to Joe Biden.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you so much to Jeannie Zaino. She is our Bloomberg political contributor. And now it's that time we're going to check on the markets and how they're reacting to today's stories. I'm almost hesitant to ask, but here she is, Abigail Doolittle. How are we doing, Abigail?
Well, yeah, another bearish day here for the markets. And I think what's really spooking investors, we of course have stock sliding, but I think is the big rally in bonds. Bonds are in a epic record rally, the 10-year yield well below 1% at this point. So stock investors worrying what that's about. High yield spreads are also blowing out to levels last seen in 2018 and then in 2016. That tells you that those high yield bondholders that they're demanding more payment relative to Treasury because the risk picture is increasing. And then you and I have been talking about the unknown around this coronavirus. You cannot value the unknown. So that's the ultimate challenge faced by stock investors.
Well, I guess that maybe answers my next question, which is there a bottom? When you come to yields, just take yields on the 10-year and things like that, is there a bottom? Because if you were just paying attention to the bond market itself, you'd say we're headed toward a recession. This is really looking not very good.
Well, if you paid attention to the bond market, you could say that we're headed to a recession. The other day we were talking about the yield curve, and very interesting, we of course had that inversion last August. It was very brief, but when that is followed by steepening in the past, that has preceded a recession and also a market top. Relative to a bottom, I think that you really do need to know here in the U.S., have a better sense of what this coronavirus really is and what will the impact of it be on the corporate bottom, the corporate profit outlook. We just don't know right now. There aren't the tests out there, as you and Kevin were talking about. Until we have that information, traders are going to be very uncomfortable, and that's what all of these different barometers, market gauges are telling you.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton. He is here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump has signed that $7.8 billion emergency coronavirus spending bill. The measure reimburses state and local governments for the cost of preparing for and fighting the virus. The president also said he believes the markets will recover from recent losses.
I
think financial markets will bounce back as soon as this really bounce back. Don't forget, they're down probably 10 or 11% from, where they were, but they were up 70%. So, it's a relatively small piece.
Mr. Trump is set to visit the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta this afternoon. There are more than 200 confirmed infections in the United States. Iran warns it may use what it calls force to limit travel between cities. Iranian health officials didn't elaborate on that threat, but did acknowledge the coronavirus is now in all of the country's 31 provinces. Iranian media posted images of long lines of traffic as people try to reach the Caspian coast from Tehran, despite authorities telling people to stay home. There are more than 4,700 confirmed cases of the virus in Iran. 124 people have died. OPEC talks collapsed in Vienna today, sending oil prices plunging. Delegates failed to reach a deal as Russia refused to bend to pressure from the cartel to make deeper production cuts. It's the worst-case scenario for OPEC, which took a high-stakes gamble that it could force Russia to join a 1.5 million barrel supply reduction. Oil producers are trying to offset the impact of the coronavirus, which has hammered demand. The United Nations Migration Agency reports what it calls a grim milestone regarding deaths of migrants who try to cross the Mediterranean. Officials now estimate that 20,000 people have died since 2014. That includes the presumed drowning of more than 90 people after a small boat overturned after leaving Libya last month, and the disappearance of a ship that set off from Algeria. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, hiring surged last month in the United States, but can the labor market hold up as the coronavirus spreads? We ask Austin Goolsbee of the University of Chicago Booth School. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The U.S. labor market surprised to the upside last month with 273,000 new positions created and wages going up about at the rate of 3% per year. And the president's senior economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, said those numbers show just how strong the U.S. economy is, although he did warn that growth might be a little slower in the second quarter.
Some of the China influence is already affecting us, but the numbers are probably better than anybody thought. You may be 2.5% to 3% in the first quarter. I know, as a realist, economic growth is likely to slow in the second quarter and maybe the third.
For his take on the state of the U.S. economy, looking forward, we welcome now Austin Goolsbee. He's former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and currently he is economics professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, coming to us from Chicago. Welcome, Austin. It's really great to have you with us. You heard what Larry Kudlow had to say. As an economist who's managed this, including from inside the White House, what is your take on where the state of the economy is today and where it's going?
Well, it was a solid jobs number. The GDP growth has been modest at best. You know, as you saw at the tail end of last year, growth sputtered out down to 2%, and most of the forecasts are nowhere near the 3% that Larry Kudlow was talking about. They're 2% at best. There are a bunch saying that we might get down into the ones, and then this danger coming from the virus, I don't know. If I were in Larry Kudlow's position, and he's a friend, I'm not criticizing him as a person, but I would not be trying to get out front and assure people that everything is fine and we're going to be growing 3% over the course of the year.
Yeah, and Austin, one of the things that strikes me is there's a range of possibilities here. We don't really know how bad this is or how it could get. It might not be that bad. It might be much worse than what some people are anticipating. You have a piece out in the New York Times just today on this subject, and you say, look, at the outbreak in the United States might be less than China, but at the same time, you said if there was an equivalent outbreak here, you said that it might easily have a worse impact in the United States than in China. Why is that?
Yeah, on the economy,
yes,
not on the health side.
Yeah.
Because if you look at what happens, there are kind of two steps in what happens. One is the negative impact on the supply chain in manufacturing, and that's sort of what you've seen so far. But then the whole step two is the fear factor, and everybody self-regulating, self-quarantining, not going out to restaurants, not flying on airplanes, not going to the gym, and stuff like that. And my only point is if you look at the big rich economies, of which the U.S. is the biggest and the richest, our economies are more dominated by those face-to-face services than the Chinese economy is. So if everybody stops going out to restaurants and stops flying on airplanes and doesn't go on cruise ships and stuff like that, that's a bigger hit on our economy than it was in China. So hopefully the health and medical side will not show a virus spreading as rapidly here as it did in China. But if it does, I'm kind of nervous that the impact on growth would be even bigger than the really major impact they already had in China.
Yeah, and Austin, you make a terribly important point, which is, first and foremost, this is a health issue and a personal tragedy, frankly, for people who are dying. We should focus on that. At the same time, there are economic effects, and that's what we're talking about here, are the economic effects. Let's talk about what one might do about it, because we, as I say, don't really know. There's an over and under on this that's pretty big, it seems to me, about how bad it might be or it might not be that bad. Let's talk about what could be done. Let's start with monetary policy. As you know, we had the Fed with an emergency rate cut of 50 basis points this week, and we had the chairman, Jay Powell, go out and talk about why that was. I talked with Larry Summers for an episode of Wall Street Week that will air tonight at 6 o'clock, and this is what he said. He was not very complimentary of what Mr. Powell did. This is what he said.
The choreography was a calamity. I mean, what was the reason for foreshadowing it on Friday, except to assure that you'd create a buy on the rumor, sell on the news situation? What was the reason for continuing to have leaks coming out of the system early in the week? I don't see how they could have thought that this was going to be highly effective.
And Austin, as you know, the markets did not react particularly well to what was done there. Did the Fed make a mistake? Did Jay Powell make a mistake?
You know, I don't know. I think Secretary Summers is right that anytime you get the Fed either leaking information or foreshadowing, we're thinking about on Monday doing this, you open the door to rapid trading and kind of dealing in information, which can be problematic. Now, the Fed is not alone. You've seen around the world the central banks trying to come forward saying, we see that this could be a problem, and we just want everyone to know that we're on it and we're willing to cut rates. The thing that makes me kind of nervous is the double whammy. That first, we all know that the Fed's got a lot shorter runway because rates are starting lower than they normally are at trying to fight recessions. And then the second is a virus-induced recession in which people just don't want to leave their houses for a couple of months or so as they wait for the virus to go by. That strikes me as a very different scenario than a normal business cycle. And so I don't know that tax cuts or rate cuts are those. Maybe we should be thinking about monetary and fiscal stimulus, but I'm a little afraid that even if we do those stimuli, that we're going to come back and look and say, their impact was much smaller than they normally are because for whatever reason, you gave a tax cut. Nobody still wanted to leave their house to go spend their tax money. And so I think we're going to, if this gets here, it causes us, we ought to redouble our efforts to try to slow the spread of this virus, because if it does get here, I don't think that dealing with the economic impacts of it are going to be as easy as maybe people think.
Boy, that sure sounds right. I think that we got to do whatever we can, including testing, to know how big a problem we really have, because right now we don't have a sense of that. But as opposed to stimulus through fiscal, what about remediation in this sense? We're going to have a lot of small businesses particularly who are going to really be stressed if, in fact, we don't have people going out to dinner, if they're not buying airplane tickets and things like that. Should we be having a facility in place to try to help tide them over, maybe even loans, sort of the way FEMA would do when a tornado struck?
Yeah, in a way, it's exactly the style of thinking that the Fed uses at the discount window in a crisis. That if you say, look, the financial institutions are long-run solvent, there's just a short-run panic going on. I think they ought to be open to explore all kinds of things like that. And now that's probably on the fiscal side, not the Fed that does it. But I think they should be open to thinking through things like that. If it has this feature that everybody's going into hiding for a short period, but we think that in a few months it's going to come back to something like normal.
Okay, thank you so much, Austin, for being with us today. Really appreciate this. Austin Goolsbee, he's former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. Still ahead here, a strong jobs report hasn't been enough to calm investors' concerns about the coronavirus. Stocks are plunging as treasuries surge. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Stocks are tumbling for a second day while Treasury yields plunge to new record lows over concerns about the coronavirus and what effect it may have on the global economic recovery. We now have Kaylee Lines here with more. What's going on?
Yeah, well, we're heading back down toward the lows of the session. The S&P 500 is now down by about 3%. I would say that is really a dramatic move, but we have moved by more than 2.5% every single day this week. Wow. Remember, we started this week with a big move to the upside. We have now wiped out our gain for the week. And I think what you're seeing is a stock market that is starting to reflect the same amount of fear you're seeing in the bond market. Anywhere you look, when it comes to treasuries, even bonds, which hit record lows earlier today, you are seeing yields absolutely tumble. The 10-year is now at about 72 basis points. And the farther out you go on the curve, the more dramatic it is. The 30-year down by 27 basis points. That is the biggest one-day drop since all the way back in 2011. So you're seeing some serious reflection on how concerned the market is about the economic growth story.
And by the way, that should be enough, but it's not. We have oil with an OPEC deal that got blown up, and look at what's going on with oil.
I mean, WTI is down more than 8%. That is on pace for its worst day since all the way back in February of 2015, now at its lowest since August of 2016. OPEC now picks to not get a deal during what could potentially be one of the more serious demand shocks the oil market has seen in many, many years. So it's a really brutal story. And of course, oil, as we know, also tied to economic growth. It's just a painful day, and no surprise, you're seeing energy stocks hit incredibly hard off the back of that in today's session.
Exactly, and they didn't get a deal after they got everybody's hopes up.
Right.
In some ways, even worse. It's like, we have a deal, no, we don't. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines. Up next, are the policymakers in Washington measuring up to the task of dealing with the health crisis? We're going to talk with political science professor Michael Berkman of Penn State. That's next on Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. President Trump will visit the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta this afternoon. The trip was initially canceled because of concern that someone at the CDC may have contracted the coronavirus. The president will stop there before he goes to his Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida for the weekend. Mr. Trump is first headed to Nashville, where he plans to meet with Tennessee's governor and survey this week's tornado damage. More than 100,000 people around the world have been confirmed to have the coronavirus. The number jumped after a spike in reported cases in Europe and Iran. One positive note, however, China is seeing a drop in the number of infections and deaths. That's where the coronavirus outbreak began. The Trump administration has moved a step closer to requiring the collection of DNA samples from many undocumented immigrants being held on criminal charges in the United States detention facilities. Under a new rule, the Department of Homeland Security can collect samples that would be put into a massive database operated by the FBI, used to identify and locate violent criminals in the country illegally. Civil liberties groups say it sets a dangerous precedent. Families of those who died in the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in 2014 are bracing for a trial that begins next week in the Netherlands. 3 Russians are accused of mass murder for their alleged roles in the shooting down of the plane over Ukraine. The jet was headed from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it was brought down by a missile fired from Russian-controlled territory. Russia has denied any involvement. All 298 people on board were killed. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Each day brings new, disturbing news about the spread of the coronavirus and the threat to our people and our economy. It's a time when we turn to our government for leadership. Well, is it delivering what we need and should expect? We turn now to an expert on how governments work. He's Professor Michael Berkman of Penn State, where he is the director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. So welcome, Professor. Really good to have you here. Let's go to that core question. How do governments, our government, particularly the United States, how does it respond to a healthcare crisis like this?
Well, it's complicated because of federalism, of course. So the national government has certain responsibilities, and I think the public largely turns to the national government for information and to feel confident about how things are being handled. But the state governments are actually responsible for a lot of the public health measures that will affect people's lives.
Well, that federalism always complicates things. It's our strength and sometimes maybe our weakness as well. But to what extent do we have a sense of the extent to which the United States government, through the CDC and other federal agencies, is able to influence or even direct the state and the local agencies? So we have, for example, similar protocols across the country.
Right. And of course, they can help with money, which is what happened today. So the president signed a bill which is going to provide more funds to state and local governments to deal with this. And then, of course, the federal government can also set certain requirements and regulations as circumstances might require. But to this point, I mean, most of the travel bans, of course, travel restrictions come out of the federal government, but then states are setting up their own states of emergency and social distancing rules and things along those lines.
At the same time, I would think that it would be a pretty courageous state official who stood up and disagreed with the federal government if they did come out with guidelines and so on. I mean, presumably all of our government officials, state, local, and federal, all want the same thing, which is to get rid of this thing as fast as we can.
Of course, that's absolutely true.
So yes, there's something of a bully pulpit
they try
when it
to
comes
be on the
Washington.
same page. Yes, and I think that the White House is doing a better job on the optics of communicating each day what's going on. I think the experts have been out front and taking a vocal role, and that's important because people look to Washington for that.
What about clarity of communication? Because there hasn't always been agreement among some of the officials that we're hearing from about some of the numbers, how are the fact and figures. For example, on the test kits.
Yes, well, it's not unusual in this administration for the president to sometimes disagree with his own administration. We've seen that here. I think in the case of a health emergency, it can be particularly concerning. People are looking for information. They're looking for accurate information, and they're looking for consistent information. The testing is, to me, a real problem because when they do start testing, then we're going to suddenly see a lot more cases.
Exactly, and even before you get to that, it's unclear how many kits are going out. We've had various numbers out of the Secretary of Health and Human Services about how many are going out, maybe 100,000 or something. But as I understand, even after they go out, there's some training for administering the testing. We may get inconsistent results or even some false positives or negatives.
I'm sure. Yes, it's going to take a while till they get this down. This is the kind of thing that should have been set up and ready to go in advance. And, I think if there's most of the concern right now with what's come out of Washington, it has to do with setting up and being prepared for this in the time after which we first heard about this in China till it really got over here.
What about the idea of having the vice president be in charge of it all? And on the one hand, that's a pretty senior official. That's a good thing. He has a lot of experience in government. On the other hand, he has some other things to do. And let's be frank, he's not somebody the president can fire if it goes wrong.
Well, that is a good point. At least he can't fire him right now. What he does with them going forward is another story altogether. I mean, it makes sense to put somebody in charge who has a good handle on how government works and who is in a position to be able to talk to different parts of government and get them to work together. So from that perspective, putting somebody like the vice president in charge makes some sense. I mean, President Obama also did not put a health professional in charge during the Ebola crisis. He put somebody in charge who knows how government works. So that part of it makes sense to me. In terms of his time, I can't say I know for sure what else the vice president was doing. I'm sure he's able to find time for this.
What about the role of Congress? As you said, the Congress can appropriate money, which it has done now with this $8.3 billion that the president signed today, that bill. What other constructive role can the Congress play? Or is this really an executive branch function?
Well, it's very much an executive branch function, but I think Congress has an important responsibility here in terms of oversight, in terms of getting information about what had been done, about what will be done, in terms of providing a place to ask difficult questions.
So if you were advising the President of the United States today, what would you advise him to do? What's the one thing that he's not doing that he should do, or the government is not doing it should do, or the one thing it might be doing that maybe it should stop doing?
Well, I think he should be much more careful in his own public comments. That I doubt will be received all that seriously, but it's confusing at times when he's saying things in interviews, for example, that contradict or not fully consistent with what we're hearing from his health professionals.
Okay, thank you so very much, Professor. That is Michael Berkman of Penn State. He's a professor of political science there. Coming up, will the government give fiscal support to the economy? I posed that question on this week's Wall Street Week episode. Part of that conversation comes up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Markets and government officials can say all they want about the coronavirus, but in the end, it comes down to the scientists and the doctors and the health professionals for a real read on what's going on with the coronavirus. We welcome now Dr. Joshua Sharfstein. He is a Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement at Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he is also the author of The Public Health Crisis Survival Guide. He comes to us today from Baltimore. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being here. Give us your, forgive the expression, prescription right now, how we are doing on this public health crisis. What are we doing that we should be doing? What are we not doing we should be doing?
Well, this is very much a public health crisis, and people are very worried about it, and there's an enormous amount of activity going on in response. And I think it's important to think about a couple different dimensions of the response. One is organizing the government and the private sector to do what's necessary to control the disease without devastating the economy and kind of shutting down in counterproductive ways. And so I think there's a lot of activity in that area. That you have local health departments that are mobilizing to track people. You have state health departments that are planning for where patients could go. The CDC is providing overall national guidance. I think that is proceeding because we have a lot of great professionals in all those different areas. There's another dimension to this, which is communications, and it's very important that there be clear and consistent communications because fear and panic always happen with public health crises. And here I think we get mixed reviews at the moment because we have multiple messages coming out of the federal government, different messengers, confusion about testing and other things. And I think it's really important, it's going to be very important for the long term, that the people that the American public are hearing from are people with credibility, with scientific backgrounds who can be trusted. And so I would like to see more of a consistent and competent communications effort.
Dr. Sharfstein, I'm so glad that you mentioned testing, because for us who are lay people, not really professionals in this, we can't quite understand why we're not testing more people, because it's hard to really address the problem if we don't know how big the problem is. And without testing, can we really know how many people, for example, have it in the United States of America right today?
Yeah, we do not know how many people have it because there's been some problems with the test. The test that the Centers for Disease Control created didn't really work out of the box, and we've been sort of playing catch-up ever since. The FDA issued a policy to try to rapidly scale up testing, even before the agency could review the specific tests, and that's going to lead to a lot more testing availability, and hopefully will address this initial problem. But I think even though it's absolutely true we need more testing and we've had a big problem standing up testing, it's also important for people to understand that they don't necessarily need a test right now. There's a lot of sometimes thinking in this situation that if I just got a test, that could be reassuring. But the truth is, with an illness that has a 14-day incubation period, you could get a negative test, and the next day you could get sick. So using testing wisely and really understanding the results becomes really important. Right now, I think the priorities for testing are people who are sick, who have serious cough, pneumonia, and no explanation for their symptoms. Anyone who is part of a investigation of a particular case, but people who just wake up and have no known exposure and are basically feeling fine and just wondering whether they have it, this is not the time to go to the emergency department. Number one, you don't want to crowd the emergency department, and number two, you don't want to sit next to someone in the waiting room who might have coronavirus. So it's really important to put texting in context, even as we realize we don't have enough right now.
Doctor, I want to interrupt us just for a moment now, because a red headline just crossed the Bloomberg that the World Economic Forum has postponed its Riyadh summit until next year. This is, of course, not Davos. This is the one they have in Riyadh. But the one in Riyadh now has been postponed until next year. Not the only one of these sorts of events that right now is being postponed because of the coronavirus threat. So, Doctor, let's come back and let me ask you, as a public health expert, we think of this as a medical problem, as a scientific problem. Is there also a socioeconomic aspect to it? That is to say, some of the people who may be most affected and least able to address the problem may be the poorest among us. And even, for example, with respect to testing, as I understand, these tests cost some substantial amount of money. I've heard $2,000, $3,000. Most people in the United States, as we know, 40% of the country can't afford $400 for an emergency. Is there a socioeconomic danger here that actually it will spread worse among the lower socioeconomic classes because they don't have the wherewithal to deal with it?
Well, here's the thing. When it's an infection like this, it affects everyone. So if there are people who can't afford to get tested, or even worse, they can't afford to get treated and isolated, they have to go to work because it's the only way they can get money, then that risks everyone. Somebody who works in a restaurant, it's the diners who could be at risk. So it's really important for us to see this as everyone's in it together, and we really do have to help people who don't have financial means make sure they can get the testing, the treatment, and other economic support that they need. And that really does protect all of us.
Dr. Sharfstein, you said earlier that we may be playing from behind a little bit when it comes to the test kits. I don't know about other aspects of our response, but do you have a sense that we are catching up? As a country, as a government, particularly the federal government, are we catching up if we are playing from behind?
Yes, I think that in some respects we're catching up. I think in other respects we're doing, very well. I'm so impressed with the National Institutes of Health launching different kinds of studies right away, really in record speed, to try to eventually get to a vaccine or treatments that can save lives. I think that's very promising. But I do think that there's still some major question marks about whether the overall response is going to be led from a scientific viewpoint or not.
At the same time, we just had a political science professor, Professor Berkman from Penn State, on talking about the federal system of government. Is there a quality control potential issue here that you don't have, for example, in China? The regime in China and Beijing can decide what happens, and it happens. Here you have a federal government, you have got state, you've got local public health officials. Should we be concerned that there may be some disagreement or a failure to have consistency across the federal government?
Well, I think that that's both a strength and a weakness, but in many ways it's a strength of our system because I've been a local health officer. I was the health commissioner for Baltimore City here. And I'll tell you that local health officers are often some of the most trusted people in their communities. And if you're trying to reassure people in times of anxiety, having somebody, I would stand next to the doctors from Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, other hospitals, and we would provide updates and information and reassurance and guidance on things like Ebola or influenza. And so it's the same people, it's people you trust in your community. So I think having that system where it's not just one person in the White House talking and that same message is amplified sort of robotically, but that people who are trusted in communities can really help their communities make it through this, I think that that will prove to be a strength for our system.
Doctor, this has been very helpful. Thank you so much for your time. That's Dr. Joshua Sharfstein from Johns Hopkins University's School of Public Health. He also is the author of the Public Health Crisis Survival Guide. We should also note that the school that he actually serves at is supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, our parent company. One of the big questions about our response to the coronavirus is whether and when the government will give fiscal support to the economy overall, or to specific sectors that are being particularly hard hit. On this week's Wall Street Week, we talked with economists Dambisa Moyo and Nuveen's Brian Nick about how realistic it is to expect the United States government is going to be able to put forward substantial fiscal help to those who need it.
I think that there's a sort of rule of thumb when I was on the Goldman Sachs trading floors many years ago, was don't think about what politicians and policymakers should do. Think about what they will do. And we know that the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, is forecasting significant pressures by 2030 around the U.S. fiscus, both in terms of debt, but also in terms of deficits. We're already looking at $1 trillion deficit this year. So when I think about corporates and generally incomes and living standards in the United States, what is it that I know to be true? And for my sensibilities, regardless of a Democratic or Republican presidency, I think ultimately we know that taxes are going to rise.
Well, that's interesting. We have to worry about the fiscal side. At the same time, we don't hear about that from either side. Yeah. There are no fiscal hawks left.
There's no plans to reform Social Security or Medicare on any of these platforms.
We're not going to touch those entitlements.
What's interesting is if you compare the growth during the second Obama term versus what almost is the completion of the first Trump term, the biggest difference is fiscal policy. Extremely loose during the Trump administration and extremely tight during the second Obama term because of the mix of government. So what happens when you get a Democrat in the White House and you have at least a partially Republican Congress, that's the only scenario where I think you get fiscal tightening because the Republicans don't want to give the Democratic president everything they want in terms of the budget and the appropriations. So that is what you could see a replay of. If you do get a change in the White House in 2021, is you could see, at least on the discretionary side, some of these kind of budgetary constraints start to come back in.
You can catch the full episode of Wall Street Week airing on Bloomberg Television and Radio starting this evening at 6 o'clock New York time and continuing through the weekend. Coming up here, equities and yields falling again today. We cover the markets next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It has been, I think it's fair to say, quite a week in the markets. And here to wrap it up on this Friday afternoon is Katie Lyons. We have a little time left to trade, but where are we?
Well, right now we are lower. We're lower for a second day. You're seeing really any kind of optimism that may be out there about possible fiscal stimulus, monetary policy easing, really outweighed by the fact that the market is at this point very concerned about the coronavirus. Right now, we're down by about 2.5% on the S&P 500. If we hold at these levels, it will mean every single day this week saw a move of 2.5% or more. It has really been a roller coaster. This week alone, we've seen an up day of more than 4%. We've seen a down day of more than 4%. And at the end of it, if you were to look at a 5-day chart of the S&P 500, we're going to be essentially flat. At least right now on the week, we're only down by 0.2%.
Wow.
So for all that drama, we basically got nowhere.
Yeah, and by the way, 2.5%, that's not a great number, but it's better than it was at one point today. It's off the lows. And in fairness, it's come back up. Why is that?
We're also off the highs. I mean, the market really has yet to make up its mind, I think. And we've gotten some conflicting reports. We were hearing from James Bullard, the St. Louis Fed president, on Bloomberg Television earlier today. Then we heard from Larry Kudlow. We also heard from President Trump when he was signing that nearly $8 billion coronavirus spending package. All of them sending different signals about how and when they're willing to act. You had Bullard saying, we'll do everything that we can. Everything is on the table. You had Trump saying the Fed should cut. It's up to them to still stimulate. And then you had Larry Kudlow saying, well, fiscal stimulus maybe is
temporary
an
and targeted. He kept saying temporary and targeted, but we're not ready to talk about it yet.
Yeah, so I think the market just doesn't have a lot of faith in any of those particular actions because we're getting such mixed messaging. But on that targeted stimulus, one thing that is higher in the equity market today, which has not been the case for really the past several weeks, is airlines.
Wow.
Because part of that targeted stimulus conversation, according to reports, is maybe deferred taxes for industries like travel and airlines that have been heavily impacted by the virus. So it's actually the likes of United United, American, which I should say are down some 40% on the year. They're actually a little bit higher in today's session.
Well, in that interview on Bloomberg, Larry Kudlow says, I don't want to talk about the airlines. We'll talk about that later. I don't want to talk about it, but they were in to visit the White House. And I thought he was sort of signaling, yeah, we're thinking about the airlines at least.
Yeah, so I guess we'll see what happens, and we'll see what happens in terms of all fiscal policy, monetary policy. What I will say is in terms of monetary policy and just growth prospects in general, for everything we're seeing in equities, it is nothing to compare to what we're seeing in the bond market.
We're not going to end up flat in the bond market.
Absolutely not. I mean, I am looking at a chart right now that just shows the move in the bonds so far in 2020. I would remind you we are about 2 months into the year, 110 basis points lower on the 30-year, 117 basis points lower on the 10-year. We're sub 75 basis points on the 10-year yield. I mean, these moves have been so dramatic. They've been so rapid. And I think what you're seeing today is the stock market really trying to catch up to the bond market in terms of how much the market should fear this coronavirus.
Well, and the market's expecting further cuts out of the Fed. I mean, certainly by their next meeting, if not before.
Well, yeah, if not before. That was actually one of the more interesting parts of that Bullard interview. He said, we can act at any time. Don't just focus on March 18th. It could come at any time. But as for what the market's pricing, nearly 4 cuts in 2020. So they're expecting the rate to be about 25 basis points by the end of this year. That is very high expectation.
And the Fed did act at any time this week, and how did the markets react? Not so well. They didn't like it so much, so I'm not sure that worked so well.
I'm not sure it had the intended
No,
effect.
exactly right. Okay, many thanks to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons for that report on the markets. Coming up here, Balance of Power is going to be continuing on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to stay across the response to coronavirus and the markets, and for that matter, on the voters as well. And remember, you can catch the full episode of Wall Street Week airing on Bloomberg Television at 6 o'clock this evening. That will be on Bloomberg.